Hi everyone, this is William. Welcome to the new installment of Life on the Magic Mountain. I'm a little late this week. My aim every week is to get one done on Friday and post it, and it's Sunday night, but it is what it is. And just for anyone who's coming to this for the first time, it's a series on Thomas Mann's 1924 novel, The Magic Mountain, which turns 100 years old this year. My dog might be a little noisy here. And it's about the novel takes place in a tuberculosis sanatorium in Davos, Switzerland. And this is a series going through the novel chapter by chapter and talking about the reality of life in Davos in tuberculosis sanatorium between the years 1907 and 1914, when the fictional Hans Castorp would have been there. And we're also looking at a non-fictional person who left an account of his life in a Davos tuberculosis sanatorium, and that person happened to be Grand Duke Dmitry of Russia, an interesting person in many ways, but we're primarily talking about him in relation to the fact that he kept a diary while he was at Sanatorium Chauchat in Davos from September 1939, till his death in March 1942 at Chauchat. So Thomas Mann and his wife had been at another sanatorium. His wife was ill. They had been at a sanatorium called Wald Sanatorium. In the book, it's referred to as the Berghof Sanatorium, and Chauchat is the only one of the Davos sanatoriums that is referred to by name by its real name in the book. But the Manns did not stay there. All right, so this chapter that we're doing this week is called Table Talk. It's a simple title. It's not really ironic, as so many of the titles are. It's really just a description of where the main activity of this chapter takes place, which is at the table in the dining room that Hans Castorp shares with other patients. So the dining room is arranged so that there are 7 tables, each one of which seats 10 people, and you're just kind of, assigned to a table. And so you get to know the people who are also at your own table. And so we start this chapter, I want to start this episode about this chapter with a reminder of this constant motif. We've talked about several of the motifs and several of the themes in the novel, and one of them that is less emphasized in the reviews of the novel than the big issues of time and illness and things like that. There's a lesser one that has to do, and that you see expressed in almost every chapter, that has to do with things like, there are repeatedly words in the novel, chapter after chapter, like shame, disgust, squalid, dissolute, sordid, indecent. And indeed, as we've talked before, one of Grand Duke Dmitry's favorite words that he used in his diaries while he was at Chauchat was sordid. He found things sordid, not because sanatoriums were, inherently sordid places, but because of the same reasons that Hans Castorp is finding. Because you are immersed in a world that has its own rules, and they're very different from what you've been used to. And if you're a person like Dmitry or like Hans Castorp, who was raised in a very strict environment, strict in the sense of there were rigid ideas about how people were supposed to behave in accordance with their social class, with their religious beliefs, and so on and so forth. So a person like this oftentimes has a lot of inner shame, right? Because anytime he feels like he's not living up to the example set by the people who raised him, it causes him feelings of shame, and he's disgusted with himself, and everything looks sordid. So in Hans, so Castorp and Dmitri were both orphans, and in Castorp's case, he was raised by very proper merchant class bourgeois, the high merchant class bourgeois in northern Germany. And like Dmitri, he had a number of caregivers. And one of them in particular, his grandfather, was a very stern figure. In fact, Hans Castorp liked to picture him as he appeared in a portrait with a Spanish ruff, and very rigid, all in black. No humor, nothing like that. And Hans Castorp had only been maybe at most 2 years with his grandfather before his grandfather died, but that made such a huge impression on him. And it was so important to him that everything be dignified and proper. And so, yeah, you're going to have with somebody like that, you're going to have this inner guilt, right? This inner sense of shame anytime you give into things like that. And Dmitri also was raised by a variety of people, but one of the most important, what happened to this icon? It's dirty. Was this woman. So as you can see, he was actually raised by a nun for towards the end of his childhood, from the time he was about 13 years old until he was a young man of 18 and was able to leave home. He was raised by a nun. And in fact, she had become one of his caregivers earlier on when he was 11. But her husband was killed. He was assassinated. Her husband was the Governor General of Moscow and was himself a very, very rigid man, much more rigid even than the nun. And so she became a nun after her husband's death. And yeah, I suppose it's hard for most of us to imagine. Even I didn't go to Catholic school, but even if you went to Catholic school, you would go home at the end of the day, and the nuns wouldn't be, well, if you went up to a boarding school, maybe not. But you can see where both of these men would have sort of struggled with that. And it's not surprising that they use these kind of words in relation to what they were encountering in the sanatorium. And whether other kinds of patients felt that way or not, I don't know. I'm trying as much as possible to gather new sources all the time, new firsthand accounts of life in a sanatorium. I haven't really found that kind of thing expressed in diary entries and letters and things that I've read about people in public sanatoriums. But so maybe, maybe the fictional Hans Castorp and the real Grand Duke Dmitri were kind of outliers, but it makes me wonder about Thomas Mann. This is the only biography of Thomas Mann that I personally have read. Thomas Mann, Eros and Literature. So you can kind of see what the focus is, and it's by Anthony Heilbutt, and it's very, very good. He is or was a professor at one of the California, UCLA or Berkeley or something, I believe. It's very good. And, this is just one biography and it's just one person reading it, me. But I got the impression that Thomas Mann himself would be the kind of person who, he was brought up the way Hans Castorp was, although his parents were alive, so he wasn't sort of shuttled between relatives. But that he was probably precisely this kind of person who was drawn to things outside of the kind of strict conventional bourgeois world, but had a corresponding shame, inner shame, kind of tied up with that. Okay, so now table talk. What is the table talk? Well, we're not talking about general conversations that Hans Castorp has with his fellow patients. We've already heard something about that. We're talking about one specific exchange that he has with one specific person who sits next to him at the table, not his cousin Joachim, but a school teacher, a German school teacher, an unmarried woman who's called Fräulein Engelhard. And so she is, by the parlance of the day, she's a spinster. And she has noticed Hans Castorp's interest in Frau Chauchat, whom he's so smitten by. And she and he engage in this constant teasing, the pretext being that Fräulein Engelhart is the one who's fascinated by Frau Chauchat, and Hans Castorp kind of scolds her for being so interested in that sort of thing. And they both know that he's the one who's smitten, but they play this kind of game together. And in fact, Mann writes, he took unwholesome delight in flirting with the old maid. And he describes that activity as squalid and says that it took him into murky waters. And sounds innocent, right? But such were Hans Castorp's hang-ups that even though he was really enjoying this, he was ashamed of himself for doing this. And he had meanwhile developed his grandfather, who was quite an elderly man when little Hans lived with him, had some kind of palsy, so that his head, he couldn't quite hold steady, and he would sort of rest it on his upper chest. And Hans Castorp has developed a similar thing, not as pronounced, but he's developed this trait as well, even though he's like 24 years old. And he realizes that it is psychosomatic. It's not merely of organic origin, he tells himself, but it is rather the expression of an inner excitement. So he realizes that he's not developing a disease that is causing this. And it particularly disgusts him. It causes him profound disgust, we're told, when he sees that Fräulein Engelhart has developed the same sort of, in sympathy with has developed this same head bobbing. And yeah, that really disgusts him. But again, there's like this divided self, and he continues on with this, what Mann calls the unwholesome flirtation, his unwholesome delight in flirting with the old maid. So that's another word that we can add to this list that I recited at the beginning, unwholesome. Okay, and then we have another word, cunning. So cunning, this is another underworld word. We've talked in the past about how the sanatorium is for Hans Castorp really the underworld, kind of in a mythological sense. And cunning, so Thomas Mann tells us that in these exchanges that he has every day, multiple times per day with Fräulein Engelhart, there is a cunning that was actually foreign to him. And then again, later in the chapter, he refers to it as an unnatural cunning. And so, so we are very much in the underworld here, and we are very much looking at Hans Castorp being corrupted by his residence in the underworld, something that his mentor, Herr Settembrini, repeatedly tries to warn him about, that he's adapting and that he himself is being corrupted by this environment. Okay, so we have then all of those things. He sees them in their undesirable form, but that is really overshadowed by the fact and overwhelmed by the positive side of it, by not positive, that's not the right word, but his desire, his strong inner desire, not just for Frau Chauchat, but for what she represents to him. What she represents is freedom and an absence of shame. And in fact, one of the other habits he develops when he's sitting at the table is to put his elbows on the table, which he considers, the quote, is permissible at best in the dissolute company of the sick. So since this is a sordid, dissolute group of people, he can do it, but it still disgusts him. But he's very much smitten by Frau Chauchat because to him, we're told Russian women are by their very nature so very free and liberal. So that's his own. I mean, I've known lots of Russian women in my day, both Russian men and Russian women, and I wouldn't characterize them as being more or less free and liberal than people that I know from other countries or from the U.S., but that is Hans Castorp's stereotype, and this is a very powerful symbol for him. And we go further. We're told, we learn through Fräulein Engelhardt, that Frau Chauchat is not only from Russia, but she's from Dagestan, which is in Central Asia. And Fräulein Engelhardt describes it as somewhere far to the east beyond the Caucasus. So you could hardly go any further east for someone who only would really respond to a European person. Such were the prejudices of the day. And it's as far as undoubtedly both Fräulein Engelhardt and Hans Castorp himself could conceive of the East, but in a European context. Even though Dagestan is in Central Asia, she herself is Russian. Her husband is Russian, despite the French surname. And so this is, the symbol of Frau Chauchat is as important as the woman herself, and the fact that Hans Castorp allows himself to pursue her tells us just how very, very deeply and profoundly he desires the kind of freedom from shame that is always present with him. All right, and just in a side note, if you happen to be at Schatzalp in the spring or summer, there are rare flowers from the Caucasus. So from various high-altitude parts of the world, flowers have been planted in the Alpinum, and some of them come from the Caucasus. So if you go and have a look at those, then think of Frau Chauchat. Okay, so what do we learn? Changing gears a little, what do we learn about Frau Chauchat herself? Well, I can tell you, since I am not Russian but Greek Orthodox, that Klavdia is her first name, and Klavdia is not a typical Russian name, and it's not an Orthodox name. It's a Western Christian name going back to Rome. You had the Emperor Claudius and that sort of thing. So that's a little interesting. She's obviously unusual. Her surname, Chauchat, is rare. Her first name, she's a Russian woman, but her first name is not of Orthodox origin and not typically Russian, but I don't know, what Thomas Mann had in mind with that, so I can't really say any more about that. But what we learn about her is that she had been to the sanatorium before, and that on this current stay, she had been there for about 3 months. So I quote, this is Fräulein Engelhardt speaking. This is her third time already, and in between she's somewhere else at other places like this. So she's either at sanatoriums or she's at health spas in watering places. So Fräulein Engelhardt goes on to say that her husband never visits her, that she visits him now and again, not often, once a year for a little while. They live separate lives. And beyond that, she informs Hans Castorp that Klavdia is not so seriously ill that she would have to live in sanatoriums. There must be other reasons beyond that. People here generally assume there are. So that brings up the whole interesting question of why did people stay in sanatoriums when it wasn't really, it's always going to be helpful to stay in a healthy place and get good, nourishing food and get plenty of rest. That's always going to be helpful for any of us. But she doesn't have to live in sanatoriums because she does not have tuberculosis. She might have it, but if she has it, it's pretty much quiescent. So there's some other reason why she's there. And the same is true, of course, as we know, with Hans Castorp, who ends up staying for 7 years. He also does not have tuberculosis. Even more, I can say that even more reliably about him than about Frau Chauchat. It sounds like she has some sort of lymphatic or gland problem that comes into it later in the book. But so why are people staying at sanatoriums who don't need to stay at sanatoriums? So you would, of course, not find this in public sanatoriums. This is something you only found among privileged people who could stay in luxury sanatoriums like Schatzalp and like the Berghof. Why? Well, what Fräulein Engelhardt is implying is because she doesn't like, it's some reason like she doesn't want to live in Dagestan, which is the back of beyond. She doesn't like her husband. She doesn't like living with her husband. He doesn't like living with her. They prefer to lead separate lives. And meanwhile, she can do it under cover of being ill. He can tell people, and she can tell people, well, alas, we can't be together because she's ill. She needs to be in health resorts and sanatoriums. So how true is this? Actually, I think it was, it wouldn't have been the majority of people, because people like Dmitri came to sanatoriums. They absolutely did not want to be there. They were afraid of dying. They were fighting for their lives, and it wasn't a positive experience for them. And there were other people for whom, it was nice. And in fact, even in the public sanatoriums, you had people get so used to them, as I've talked about before, and to get so unused to having to worry about day-to-day things that when they left, it was a huge culture shock, and they just wanted to go back. And sometimes they would get over it, and sometimes they wouldn't. So there were plenty of patients. I'm not going to say the majority, but there were plenty of patients who were not really ill and who would make the rounds of the various watering places and the sanatoriums. And Frau Chauchat is one of these. And if you look at the Schatzalp guest list, as I've talked about many times before, you'll see that people did come and go. Even people who were really sick, they sometimes, just needed a change of scenery, and they would come and go. Dmitri never left for the whole 2.5-year period that he was there, but he was, obviously very, very seriously ill, as we see by the fact that he actually died. So you had two very different groups of people, or maybe three very different groups, some who simply weren't sick, some in the middle who, they had asthma or something like that, and they weren't dying of an infectious disease. And then you had the people who really, truly were sick. Okay, so, a sanatorium could be an escape for, we can only imagine, all kinds of things that we all have in our lives that if the opportunity arose, we might really enjoy escaping from. Okay, so another topic that I want to touch on is how central the meals are to Hans Castorp. So he describes eating every 2.5 hours. There's a meal every 2.5 hours, leading up to the last dinner, after which everybody goes and retires to their rooms and does the nighttime rest cure. So I was just looking at some sanatorium ads from the Davoser Blätter, a journal that was published in Davos during the sanatorium era. And I saw one sanatorium advertising 7 meals a day and another one advertising 6 meals a day. So I guess that breaks down to about every 2.5 hours. And I guess it really would become the central part of your life. Your life would revolve around that. If you were so oriented, I mean, Dmitri, not for him. The meals were not that, he was kind of a retiring guy by the time he was there. He was not a young person in his 20s like Hans Castorp, who wasn't ill and wanted to soak everything in and was learning so many new things. And so for him, and a lot of times he wasn't allowed to go downstairs and have his meals because he was too ill, and the doctors would either put him on complete bed rest or they would only allow him to sit up in his own room, to go sit at his desk and do things like that in his own room. So they weren't the central thing for everybody. But for Hans Castorp and for a lot of people, they were. And he puts it in this very nice way. So there were no serious interruptions between meals, no obstacles worth taking seriously. It would have been different had it been work, some worry or trouble that interposed itself. His mind could not have overlooked or bridged that sort of thing quite so easily. But such was not the case in the cleverly and pleasantly regimented life of the Berghof. So again, it's an escape. And Mann writes, when he stood up from one communal meal, Hans Castorp was already delighting in the next. And between meals, he could just let his mind go off in whatever direction he wanted to, because he didn't have to worry anything. So, for instance, on that particular day, he was thinking, maybe I'll take a walk down to the English Quarter. And in fact, the Berghof, the Wald Sanatorium, which is not now the Wald Hotel, is right immediately above the English Quarter, although the English Quarter is not called the English Quarter anymore. But if you go and stay at the Wald Hotel, or if you stay at Schatzalp and then take the beautiful hike down to the Wald Hotel and the Hohe Promenade, then you will be right above the English Quarter. So go down and take a look. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter, except I will just note that there is, I think, the third reference, maybe even the fourth, in the novel to date. We've read about a little less than 20% of the novel now. We've gone through it, and this is the third reference to what the Thomas Mann calls a healthy little goose down there in the flatlands. So these are the two options for Hans Castorp. If he goes back home to Hamburg, he will be expected and will expect himself to conform by marrying a healthy little goose. The other option, of course, is to continue to be infatuated and to pursue Frau Chauchat. He hasn't really begun pursuing her in an active way yet, but he is pursuing her. He's very conscious of her presence, of her walking across the floor in the dining room, slamming the glass door, that sort of thing. And the alternative, we're told by our friend Thomas Mann, is a healthy little goose. Well, not too kind, Thomas, not too kind. I'm sure there were plenty of women in Hamburg between 1907 and 1914 who would have been perfectly good bourgeois matches for a Hans Castorp, but were nonetheless not silly little geese. Let us hope so, at any rate. So the next chapter is a very long one. We won't be able to do it in one video. And it's one of the most profound in the novel. It's one in which Thomas Mann contemplates two grandfathers. The grandfather of his intellectual humanist mentor, Herr Settembrini, and his own grandfather with the Spanish rough. And we'll be getting into some deep stuff, so come back for that, and I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next time. Bye.